Okay, we are live.
Yeah. Thank you, Yago. Good morning. No, it's not a morning, actually. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being with us and participating in our webinar. It's the 8th webinar organized by Civic Idea with the support of Friedrich Naumann Foundation. And this time, different from all previous times, we move east of Georgia. So far, we've covered 25 countries within the European Union, UK, United States, and because of lots of questions from the audience, we obviously decided to bring the perspective of rest of the world as well, and not to be isolated within the Euro-Atlantic community. First of all, I want to give the floor to Peter Bochmann, who is the main reason why we are able to do these webinars, and then we can start with our conversation. Peter?
Yeah, thank you, Tina. I also welcome all of you on behalf of Friedrich Naumann Foundation. We are very proud to be a part of this project. It was the idea of Tina and her Civic Idea organization to organize such webinars. We started, I think, at the end of March with that. And we had a lot of interesting lecturers or speakers from all over the world, mostly liberal thinking people, because we are a liberal foundation, and even Tina is member of ALDE, the European family of the liberals. And that's why I'm also very proud today have the Vice President of ALDE with us, Heinrich. Welcome also to that panel. You have to be, you were in I think in Georgia 2 or 3 years ago. So we met, yeah. So I, again, wish you best of luck for this discussion. And it's interesting to see now, it will be interesting to see what the Asians and South Asians are saying, and also the Danes, of course.
Thank you, Peter. Let me start with the introductions. We are, it's our honor to host Ambassador of Japan to Georgia, Ambassador Tadaharu. Thank you very much for being with us. We already had a pleasure of having several other ambassadors to Georgia with us, and I hope that this tradition will continue. We have, as Peter already mentioned, Vice President of ALDE, Mr. Mörtensen, who is from Denmark originally, not obviously in our first round of discussion, we will ask you to tell us a little bit about Denmark, as you are the first participant from that country, and we have not heard how the situation is there and how did you tackle the challenge. We have Dr. Go from South Korea. Everybody in Georgia is talking about South Korea, so it's absolutely great to have you with us and to hear your story and your experience. And it's a great pleasure to have my good friend Nachiket Moore from India. We were fellows together at Yale University years back in 2004. Nachiket is working actually in the health sector in a way, so with the mixed experience of that he carries, it will be very important to hear your story. Nachiket, it's also been a kind of a puzzle in discussions in Georgia, how India, being such a huge country in terms of the population, managed to come up with more or less moderate numbers than smaller countries did it. So that's also very important to listen from you. So let's start with the ambassador. In this first round, we will go 5-7 minutes each panelist to talk about the main road your countries took in fighting pandemic, and then we will keep the discussion from there. Mr. Ambassador.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much. For having me for this wonderful event, and I'm very pleased to discuss the challenges that we are facing with Mr. Moy and Dr. Mionghyo and Mr. Mörtensen, and maybe with a little bit Asian perspective. And first, let me start with the updating of the picture of Japan. And the number of the confirmed cases as of yesterday was slightly less than 17,000, and the death toll was nearly 900. As today's Japanese population is 124 million people, so mortality rate is very low. I think it is too early to say the trajectory of Japan was successful. But I can tell you that the number of the death toll is extremely low if we compare the number with the number of the non-Asian countries. Today, that I would like to emphasize that Asian countries, generally speaking, seems to have a very good job, have done a good job so far. And in terms of the containment of virus, Taiwan, Korea, Vietnam, Singapore have done a great job. I think Japan is one of the peers of the league. And obviously, I want to include Georgia in the peer group. And why these countries, Asian countries, have been able to work well? I think this is a very, very important why to the international community. Sharing the information and the data in a positive manner. I think we can develop the right strategy in a strong and a collective and orchestrated manner. It is important for us to harness the synergies, not only for effective combating to COVID-19, but also the preparing for new pandemic, which we have to keep in mind. I'd like to welcome many whys for the better life of people in the world. In Japan, I'm very, very pleased to say that the business is slowly and carefully moving into reopen, as well as another countries. The process is a litmus paper in an attempt to avoid second wave. Of course, after a long and uneasy state of emergency, I really hope this step will bring a good result. But I think we should be humble, and the virus will not disappear completely. It is a time for us to seek how we can live together with the virus. Today, that I would like to share you the two peculiar points on Japan's fight with the virus. First, Diamond Princess, one of the largest and gorgeous cruise ships, carrying 3,700 passengers at the cruise. The ship was sailing back to Yokohama City Port of Japan with more than 2,100 old passengers over age of 60. Yes, they are the most vulnerable people against the virus. More than 1,300 Japanese passengers were on board. And during the voyage, they already found several infected cases. It is a surprise to see there is no relevant
Ambassador?
Emergency for cruise ships has been integrated. The government of Japan quickly decided to receive the ship at the Yokohama port on February 3rd at a very, very early stage of growing infection. And there were many criticisms to the handling of the government of Japan on Diamond Princess, as you know. But it is noteworthy that the government need to deal with the situation without any international guidelines. We need to make sure the requirement of a 2 weeks quarantine in the very, very small, narrow cabins was the right decision? Or any alternative for the port of Yokohama in the emergency where we are seeing big cluster in the ship? So for better future, Japan will take a leadership to establish the relevant international emergency regulation on cruise ship so that everyone can enjoy safer and pleasant sailing travel. This is the first one. And second, the legal background of the Japan's lockdown. Unlike most of the other countries, it is not possible for the government of Japan to implement compulsory stay-at-home policy that carry penalties. Japanese law has no power to force citizens to do so. The government of Japan made every effort to just ask the people for staying at home and follow the guidelines. And maybe I remember that last month, Foreign Policy magazine mocked the government policy as Japan's half-hearted coronavirus measure are working anyway. But I'm really happy to say, yes, it works. And this is a bit sensitive agenda, I think, because the matter involves the protection of the privacy or individual freedom. So for effective tracing of infection, we need to develop the relevant strategy and technology securing protection of the privacy or individual freedom. So this is just a small presentation, but again, Tina, thank you very much for letting me join your program. I hope we can discuss the matter from various angles in order to fight with the virus collectively and orchestrated. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Dr. Go, tell us about the South Korean miracle. What did you do?
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, thanks again for putting me a little bit on the spot, but I'll do my best to describe how South Korea succeeded in flattening the curve, so to speak. So, first of all, I'll give you a little bit of a quick update where we stand in terms of infections. So as of today, there are a total of 12,000, I mean, to be more precise, 11,600 infected cases, so cumulative infected cases. Actually, the 90% of them have recovered already. So those who remain hospitalized are around 850. In total, we had around 273 deaths. So that translates to a mortality rate of around a little bit more than 2%. So it's a very, it's a good job, well done. And that's because this job was, it's so possible because the South Korean government conducted a very aggressive contact tracing and testing program. So we just described that we had a little bit more than 11,000 infected cases total. But in order to find those infected cases, the government tested almost a million cases, I mean, suspicious cases, suspicious individuals. So that to translate to around, given the size of the Korean population, that translates to around 20,000 tests per million inhabitants in Korea. And then in terms of capacity, testing capacity, I think the government has been able to test up to 10,000 tests a day. But I think the maximum capacity for definitely more than that. But for whatever reason, I mean, that was the maximum number that was recorded in the statistics. So thanks to all these aggressive programs, South Korea actually didn't have to impose lockdown on the economy and the society. We are very lucky that that didn't happen. And so that minimized the damage to the economy. And so even in major geographic clusters of infection, there was no travel ban that we saw in elsewhere in the world. So there was a free movement of people at all times. But sure, we had some limited measures in social distancing, such as there was no school didn't start until actually this month. So the school year was postponed by 2 months. in Korea, the school year starts in March, and then that was postponed by 2 months. There was also a ban on the large gatherings, such as sports events and religious events. And then in addition to that, there's a voluntary request to companies to move the usual working, ways of work from coming to work every day to engage in like a voluntary commuting work at home programs. So those are totally voluntary. So in case of myself, yours truly, actually I went to work every day during the peak of the pandemic. So that was how the government tried to minimize the impact on the economy. So because of that, in terms of positive aspects, there was no restaurants closures, no shopping malls were mandated to close. So the daily life was pretty much the usual. So there wasn't much of an impact in the daily goings. But it doesn't mean that the public didn't have a heightened sense of awareness about the risk of COVID-19. People essentially engaged in voluntary social distancing measures. For instance, the number of commuters using public transportation system in Seoul went down by 20%. So, which is actually quite a huge number, because the number of commuters using the transportation system is pretty much stable, but then it went down by 20%, which is actually very surprising. And then also there was people tried to, even though restaurants were fully open, operational, people tried to stay away from crowded indoor spaces. So even though the government didn't mandate any type of this kind of closure that would affect the commercial activities, many small shop owners definitely suffer from, and companies, especially the retail sector, suffer from the fallout of the pandemic. But overall, compared to other countries, clearly South Korea came ahead. So moving from there to what are the factors that could explain for the South Korean success? I would say preparedness. There are two factors, and one is the preparedness, and that's because we had a previous experience of failure, I would say, in handling infectious disease disease like this one. Back in 2015, South Korea had a minor outbreak of MERS, which stands for the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which is actually it's related to the COVID-19 because it's another coronavirus type of infectious disease, and it's closely related to SARS that China suffered a lot from, and other East Asian countries suffered from in the early 2000s. So back in 2015, South Korea was pretty much the only country in the world that was affected by MERS, even though there are minor clusters in the Middle East. But then South Korea was the one the country that suffered a lot of, in terms of proportion, most of the death from MERS, which reached around 40 cases of death in the year 2015. So even though compared to what's going on right now with COVID-19, the number didn't seem that big for the Korean South Korean government, that was considered to be a major failure. And then I think the South Korean government conducted a very thorough soul searching about why South Korea failed to handle this relatively, compared to COVID-19, a relatively weak infectious disease. And that also reflected on our new laws that was passed in the aftermath of the MERS epidemic in 2015. And that law made actually empower the public health authorities to essentially to conduct very aggressive contact tracing programs, such as by looking into all the private data that are being, that are being very controversial these days, which is the law allowed the government to look into cell phone data. They allow the government to look into credit card usage. In addition to that, the government was able to use have access to security camera footages in order to ensure that all the contacts the infected individual has made can be completely traced. So that law was actually put into effect this time, and to a great success. In addition to that, I would like to give a lot of credit to the public health authorities, especially the Korean Center for Disease Control, or KCDC, because they essentially forecasted that the next wave of a major pandemic would be based on coronavirus type of a virus. and very similar to MERS. And then they actually expected that the next, which is COVID-19, would come from China. So when the first case of COVID-19 emerged in Wuhan earlier this year, the KCDC essentially was prepared to launch a major testing program. So then by end of January, KCDC has already came up with a massive system of very real-time PCR testing equipment. So that PCR testing equipment had a major innovation, which was to shorten the testing time. So PCR test usually took a day or two to show the results. With the new real-time PCR test kits, the KCDC was able to tell whether a person was infected or not under 6 hours. So that was actually deployed on a massive scale starting in February. So which actually really underlined the success of this very aggressive and massive contact tracing program. So I would say these are the essentially a system. These were the systemic factors, those that allow South Korea to combat the COVID-19 crisis in Korea.
Thank you, Dr. Go. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for this little interruption. I was out for a minute because the electricity is off in my office, so I've shifted to the mobile phone. Nachiket, tell us about India.
So India, as you mentioned correctly, is a very large country. And when the disease started to come to Indian shores, we were somewhat fortunate that in terms of international flights, in terms of the connectivity to the rest of the world, compared to some of the other countries around the world, we were still, while we do have high connectivity, relative to the others, it was lower. So you started to see concentration in specific geographies. But we are still at an early stage in the crisis. The disease numbers are rising every day. While the aggregate number, you're quite right, is low. We have 200,000 confirmed cases. We have about 5,000 deaths. You might argue that in a country of our size, that's still a relatively modest number. It is, and I'm very pleased from that. But to remember that about 40% of those deaths and those infections are in a single city, the city of Bombay or Mumbai. And actually the rest of the country hasn't seen this kind of impact as yet. The government acted quickly to impose a lockdown when the number of deaths were very few. Now, we don't know yet, the jury is still out on that. There is a possibility that would have helped us slow the progress of the disease. But actually, I think we didn't fully anticipate the response of the temporary workers, the migrants, that then started to move back from the cities to their hometowns. And we have as many as 300 million people that are rural residents but work in urban areas that wanted to go back because of the lockdown. So it's possible that post the lockdown you started to see an enormous humanitarian crisis emerge, where there were people walking for hundreds of kilometers. There is a story that came out of a 15-year-old girl who put her dad, who was physically disabled, on a bicycle. That was all she could buy. And then she rode 1,500 kilometers from where she was to where her home was to successfully carry her dad home. It took her days of travel. Fortunately, she received a lot of support on the way. So I would say the jury is still out. I think a few things that work well for us, though, is that we have good engineering capacity. So if you saw the number of tests that we were doing, when the crisis began to today, we've been able to ramp up capacity very, very fast in the private sector. The supply of personal protective equipment, again, quite low to begin with, India has been able to ramp up capacity fairly fast. Ventilators. We are in the fortunate situation that only about 15% of ventilator capacity is being used right now. So there are many aspects of the response that took us some time, but has been able to come up fairly quickly. And the corporate sector, which is reasonably large in India, has also stepped up to provide field hospitals, to provide support to the government in managing this crisis. So we have now large 500-bed facilities in the middle of sports complexes that have been set up with full ICU and oxygen capability in this. Now, will the disease amount to a low in the long run aggregate number? I think it remains to be seen that will happen. The good fortune we have is that the population is extremely young overall. There is a belief that, at least the data so far has shown, that the mortality tends to be concentrated in people above the age of 60. This pattern is true in India, but you are seeing more mortality in younger people in India than you do elsewhere. It's still concentrated towards the older people, but the curve is more flat in India. So you're getting more 40-year-olds, more 50-year-olds experiencing death. But with 5,000 cases, one could say it's a small sample. We don't yet know whether it is indeed the national trend that we will see. The good thing, though, is that because the disease is progressing slowly, I think every state is able to get ready early. They can observe the experiences of one state or one city and then start to prepare. So just to give you one example in closing, gradually people are starting to realize that it's not ventilators that matter, it's oxygen that matters. Because actually ventilators, very few people need, and those that go on to the ventilator actually experience high mortality. What you need is early oxygen support that can be given in non-ICU settings. So you're now starting to see a lot more interest in building oxygen capability, just simple oxygen capability relative to ventilator capability. Now I hope we will learn much more. Unfortunately, the economy is in a situation where, despite the fact that the cases are rising, India has had to reopen because the economy cannot tolerate any more of the lockdown pressure. We have lost somewhere near 60 or 70% of the formal jobs have been lost, and to get them back is going to take time. The hope is that this time period has allowed us to become better equipped to deal with the crisis, to understand where do we wear masks, what kind of preparation is needed, so that, as they say, flatten the curve to raise the line. We might not have flattened the curve, but we would have raised the line a little bit more so that we can absorb some of these extra cases a little bit better. But I would say it's still early days to tell what is going to happen in India. We're all quite concerned and watching carefully what the progress of the disease is. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nachiket. And Mr. Motterson, Denmark. We've heard, as I said, lots of stories from Europe, but it will be really important to hear what was the specific about Denmark. Your neighbor, Sweden, we had Vice Speaker of Parliament, our good liberal friend with us, who was talking about the Swedish difference from the rest of Europe. How did it go in Denmark? Did you go in lockdown or you stayed open? What was the policy?
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for being invited to this very interesting occasion. I hope I can bring some insights or experiences to the table which can be of interest to some of you. Well, basically, I view this from the point of view of a politician, or as an economist, which I am by training. So actually, I would like to say that my first consideration was to search for the response to this entirely new situation for me and for my country and for Europe to search for an attitude from a political point of view. I mean, how do you react as a liberal to this? We all have lots of experiences on how to react to economic threats or authoritarian threats and so on. But how do we react towards an enemy whom you cannot negotiate with, which you have no really means to fight? And I think to most liberals in Europe, the challenge here has been to find out how do we balance the restrictions which we've had to put on the actions of the individual. How do we balance those considerations to the need for fighting the disease? And I think this is something we're still struggling with, and we can come back to that. But the Danish experiences has been, well, not favorable, but it has been much worse in other places. We have about 500 deaths, which is 1 in 10,000. The number has been rising very, very slowly over quite some time now. The number of people in hospital is less than 100 now. So we really come to a flattening of the curves, which was the objective right from the start. You could say that the Danish government, with the total support of unanimous support of Parliament, undertook a very, very quick and strict slowdown. And even though Danes are generally very anti-authoritarian, for some reason, Danes seem to react very responsibly in a situation like this. I can just take my own case. I was in Sweden, our neighbor country, when the government convened the first press conference, and the foreign minister urged everybody to seek to come home, back to Denmark very, very quickly. And I mean, reacting as a typical Dane, I mean, my family had gathered all our stuff from our summer cottage in Sweden, and we were in the car within 1 hour and home very, very quickly. And that was the reaction of most of the Danes. Perhaps since there was unanimity in Parliament, there hasn't been much discussion about a very, very radical lockdown, which meant that everybody was seeking to get home. All companies and the public sector more or less accepted a complete shutdown within hours almost. Take the place where I earn my living in the organization of executives and managers, where I'm the political director. We have about 350 people working here. And within hours or few days, we were down to 3 people staying in the office, well, looking out for burglars and fires and so on. But everybody else found ways of working at home, bilaterally or meeting on Skype and so on. So very much the professional sector shut down very, very quickly. There was a willingness of the health sector and the transport sector, private transport and so on, to still go to work for those services which are essential to the functioning of the basic elements of society. But apart from those services which were very necessary, everybody stayed at home during this lockdown. Some of the most hard consequences of lockdown has been the thousands of people living in homes for the elderly, handicapped, and so on, who have been completely isolated from their families. And you've had heartbreaking stories about old people with dementia and so on dying on their own, which has really been a cost which has been felt strongly by everybody. Most families have managed to function, parents taking on the roles as teachers and teaching the kids from at home, until most schools managed to organize learning on Skype and so on. Public transport has been kept going to a large degree, but hardly anybody used public transport because it wasn't really necessary, because they didn't need to go to work. Public gatherings were completely banned. You couldn't, you still cannot be more than 10 persons together. You'll be fined if you are more people together. All shopping centers were shut down. All barber shops were shut down. All restaurants were shut down. And as a very brutal thing to a liberal and to somebody coming from a very small country where we all travel all over the place, one of the very hard consequences to accept was the closure of the borders. Personally, I think the closure of the borders almost gave you a feeling that you could hardly breathe. Even in the Copenhagen area, the economic Copenhagen area, well, a large part of that is actually in Sweden. So you had lots of human contacts being cut off, even though people who had to work, say in Copenhagen, in the health sector, have still been able to cross the border between Denmark and Sweden. But otherwise, borders have been closed except for commercial purposes. Now, speaking as an economist, one of the first things, without being too bizarre, economists always feel very interested in occasions like this because it sort of changes the economic experience, and we can see how the economy functions under severe stress like this. So it's always very interesting to see how the economy reacts. So we very quickly had this discussion as to whether this was sort of be what you can say a V-shaped experience, a knockdown and then returning very quickly to where we were before. Would it be a U-shaped where people were sent home, staying at home for a couple of months and then returning? Or would it be a lasting slump we entered? We still do not know. We've had a slump in our GDP of this year of about 5 or 6%. Private consumption hasn't gone down that much apart from visits to restaurants and so on. So my own personal expectation is that within a year or so, well, given that we can control the epidemic, the economy will be back more or less where it was. Of course, lots of companies have encountered lots of losses, but overall, things should be moving forward. There was unanimity also in Parliament about relief packages for companies, where the government more or less took over the wage bill of people who were sent home from companies. So in the phase we are now, there are lots of people who are not sacked from their companies, but are actually at home receiving wages, but primarily paid by the government. These measures, of course, will have to end relatively quickly. And of course, the interesting thing will be to see whether people will actually get fired and sacked so that unemployment will increase dramatically, or whether people can just sort of return to work and go on like they did before the virus. Now, the political discussion now is very much about how to open up the economy. And as I said, being a traveling liberal, of course, one of the things that has been interesting to me, as well as the whole Danish population planning for their summer holidays, has been how quickly does the government allow the opening of borders? And this is one of the areas where in Denmark we have been very, very reluctant to open up. So the situation in Denmark now and for the next, actually until the end of August, unless things are changed, is that Danes can travel freely between Denmark and Norway, between Denmark and Iceland, and between Denmark and Germany, and with some restrictions, vice versa. So it's still very painful for us to be cut off from our Swedish neighbors, which we interact with quite a lot. And the main reason, as Tin just touched upon, is that the development of the disease has been very, very different in Sweden than in Denmark. Sweden was relatively slow to react. They have had very modest lockdowns compared to Denmark, which means that the number of deaths and so on in Sweden has been so much higher. So that is what the government gives as the reason for keeping the borders closed to Sweden is that we have been pursuing different strategies. Now, one of the things, and I should end with that, is that to the opposition in politics, which includes my own party, is that I think in situations like these, it's very tempting to develop semi-authoritarian attitudes by governments. And even though I would not say that the Danish government has come anywhere near authoritarian attitudes, you can still see some signs. For instance, the government has been much more reluctant than necessary when it comes to opening up information about the spread of the disease, the discussions inside the government and inside the administration as to which measures were necessary. The government has interfered in the considerations of the administration about what would be the correct attitude. For instance, we have one very conspicuous example where the Danish health authorities received an order from the Minister of Health saying that we're not interested in your sort of scientific advice, we're interested in advice which underpins the strategy of the government. Of course, I've given it in my own words now, but that was very much the case. And that has created an uproar in Denmark because we're very much used to the scientific community and the administration working independently of the political leadership. But to sum it up, we're in the phase now where we're opening up, and I think there are still hundreds of thousands of Danes who are hoping that the border towards the south will be open, so that towards the end of summer they may be able to go to Italy, Spain, Greece, France like they used to. But personally, I think that's probably a bit optimistic.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So I assume that my ticket that I have for Copenhagen is still non-applicable. I was supposed to come in June for the Copenhagen summit. Obviously, it's not going to happen, and hopefully we will be able to do sometimes in the fall at least all the travel and everything. Just a very little update about Georgia. Normally during these webinars, we have a Georgian speaker who shares the Georgian experience, but as today we do not have, I will kind of assume that role. We've been doing pretty well particularly compared to our neighborhood. Georgia has recorded a little bit over 700 cases so far, and we have only 13 deaths, which I believe is a pretty good case to talk from our side. The main reason, or one of the main reasons for this success was exactly as our Danish colleague was speaking, a very strict, very quick and very strict lockdown that happened in pretty early days of spread of pandemic. And also the fact that on declaring emergency rule, the whole political elite was united. So there was not that much of a political fight in the country. Just the opposite, the opposition parties were the ones who were demanding for the lockdown rather than the ruling party did. So we have managed to go through this difficult path pretty well when it comes to the health professionals, to the way how the doctors and health managers worked during the process. They proved to be extremely professional and extremely responsible. They raised lots of confidence among the people, so there was no panic at all in a country. And the smart move on the side of the government, should be said, was that they basically gave the floor to the health professionals, and for the whole 2.5 months we were hearing all the messages, all the policy decisions, mainly from the National Center for Disease Control and all the other guys who were dealing with the problem from the medical point of view. Unfortunately, our democracy was not as well prepared for the pandemic as the health sector proved to be, and we had lots of failures in this way. For example, it was mentioned how the parliaments were making decisions, or ambassador was saying that because of the legal restrictions, Japan could not tell to the people to stay home legally, and it was more of a suggestion. In Georgia, unfortunately, whatever is written in a constitution and law is kind of a conditional or suggestion to the rules. So we can be advised by the laws and constitution, but it's not necessarily the rule of the game. So the very big problem we had was that Parliament was basically gone during the whole pandemic. They decided to have a little break for themselves rather than actually work and rule and make the policy decisions necessary. So anyways, whatever was the practice, from the, again, healthcare point of view, we did pretty well. So as the results are positive, obviously no one is going to remember all the downsides of the lockdown and all the problems we've been experiencing in terms of the work of democratic institutions here. But we've been hearing from Mr. Mortensson. He actually started this portion of our discussion about the economy, long-term, short-term, how long the effects will be there. What is it that you see as an opportunity for cooperation, for more unity of the democratic nations on all sides of the globe, whether it's across Atlantics, or these are Asian democracies, whether it's Japan, South Korea, European Union as a whole, or single countries for that matter within the European Union, United States. Is there is lots of skepticism about states becoming more self-centered rather than open to the way of globalization. We knew it and we worked through it. What will be your assessment of the situation from today's perspective? Obviously, we don't know where we will be in August or at the end of the year still, and unfortunately, as Nachiket said, jury is still out and we do not have final verdict. But if you look at the process from today's perspective, how do you see the globalization in today's world? How it's gonna go from here? Are we gonna have more unity, or we are gonna have more self-centered decisions from developed world, basically trying to escape the trap of unemployment and loss of jobs that we've been seeing during the pandemics? So if anyone wants to take the floor first.
I take a step. Hello?
Ambassador, maybe with Japan. I've been reading lots of incentive packages coming out of the Japanese government lately, particularly because of the interest of Georgia. I was researching on what are the tourism incentive packages out there, and some of the policies that were announced in Japan were pretty interesting and attractive. How do you see the economic recovery from today's point of view, obviously?
Well, thank you very much. And this is a very interesting and important agenda. And in Japan, we have a lot of different opinion about democracy. What kind of the democracy under the situation of the emergency? And some people support we need a more, strict, compulsory staying home or any other measurements against the virus. And also that some people say that we need a democracy and we shouldn't, compel our peoples to do so. So I think it's too early for me to say this is a right decision or right measure to think about for the future treatment. And the reason why that I talked about the international community need to discuss this, and based on very transparent data or information, And it's because, we learn a lot from Korea, we learn a lot from Europe, and we learn a lot from United States. And so it is very important to establish the, more forward-looking democracy to fight with, virus. And I worked for the insurance company for a long time. So I think this is one of the most difficult agenda to deal with as a human being. We call insurance companies as very familiar with to deal with risk management, and of course, after the insurance function of the insurance is after the financial response after the disaster risks. So we call disaster risk finance. So before the pandemic, we need to prepare. But that the preparedness is always a balance between the cost and the loss to be expected. So we need to discuss about what is a good point for strike the balance. And after the pandemic, disaster risk finance is a very, very important thing for us to discuss globally. And every country, especially the developing country, is a very much, experiencing the hard times for finance to revitalize the economy. And not only the developing country, the advanced countries also have a big burden to place the economic situation back on its feet. So what is the right answer to these specific issues, globally maybe? And the difficulty of the pandemic is not, we can't discuss this within the country, because the virus is always coming from abroad, and also that the spreading in the specific country. But that we need to discuss and deal with this very important agenda as a whole world. So I really want to ask United Nations or any other international organization to take up. And we have the agenda we need to tackle is not one country's agenda. This is a global agenda because pandemic virus move very quickly and very easy on the border.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Motterson was asking for the comments.
Yeah, just a few considerations. Very early on, within the European Liberal Party, ALDE, we had our concerns as to how would this pandemic affect the political situation in Europe? How would it change the relative strength of different political parties and political views? And of course, many places in Europe, we are struggling with nationalist, populist currents. And could these people somehow steal the show, as you may say, and use this situation to further their political views? The situation in Europe, at least, very often is that the most efficient of the populists or nationalists are very good at seeking out issues which are deadly relevant to people. So they find important issues, but they deliver very dangerous answers to the cases. I think that the main experience so far, most of the places in Europe at least, has been that people have rallied around responsible political leaders and responsible political parties. You have some places where populist leaders, like in Hungary, have used the opportunity to increase their power, which of course is not particularly attractive. But by and large, I think in many ways, people have rallied around responsible politicians. But it's definitely something you have to be aware that you have to work on responsibility and to gather people around the views which are really productive and sound. One of the aspects, however, which we have seen is that in several European countries, you've had this pandemic giving rise to criticisms towards the European Union. For instance, in my own country, people say, oh, this shows that the European Union has been very inefficient. They haven't been able to secure cooperation on how to counter the pandemic and so on. But it's a very, very shameful argument, because the problem actually in Europe has been that the European Union does not have the means to formulate and carry out common policies in these areas. Because I feel it's very, very sad that we've seen European countries within the European Union fight each other about medical supplies, be it ventilators or other essential equipment. I have to say that I find it embarrassing that my own country, for instance, kept many more ventilators which we've ever would have the use for, whereas in Italy people were crying out for help and nothing was supplied from my own country. We really should have had a European response to an issue like this. So in my view, this experience from European point of view is a demand for more Europe, not less Europe. Another thing, speaking as a politician as well as an economist, there's the danger that this situation leads to more protectionism for very good reasons. I mean, very understandable reasons. Most of the governments in Europe are talking about sort of taking home the production of essential health products, medicine and ventilators and what have you. And that is, of course, something which will harm the economic prosperity of not just Europe, but the world. So this is something we will have to look into, and we have to be very much aware to avoid more protectionist measures which can be justified. And of course, there's a huge cost culturally, economically, politically, that we are all staying at home. I mean, Copenhagen Airport, which just besides where I sit now, is usually very, very busy. These days, there are about 10 planes coming or leaving every day. And of course, we all look forward to coming back to a situation where we can meet across borders, which of course is very important in Europe, because Europe consists of so many small countries like my own. Now, just to finish up with one thing, I mean, the World Health Organization as an organization is much more important than ever. And without going into detail, I think it's very regrettable that we have the current American administration using these opportunities to dig barriers or build barriers between our nations rather than support a global corporation in the WHO, which of course is not without flaws. But we should have used the WHO to look into the Chinese actions and not to leave the WHO and thereby leaving the WHO at the mercy of China.
Thank you very much for that. And I go to Mr. Go, and along to the issues that we were talking about, please do comment about this final statement by Mr. Murtason about the China. We all know, we are all observing and watching how this myth about Europe failing is playing out, and there is a special credit to go to Chinese and Russian propaganda machinery also, who are nicely playing this card of democracies, basically, not just the European Union, but democracies failing in front of the pandemic and crisis, and more or less authoritarian countries being better in managing the situation. Dr. Go, how did it play in South Korea? I believe that you must be one of the subjects of that huge propaganda machinery. And please tell us what's the
Sure,
situation
clearly.
there, both from, yeah.
Sure, yeah. I think that's a very good question, especially when you contrast South Korean practices to Chinese practices. I mean, in terms of effect, the two countries have implemented a very similar way of combating the virus, I mean, the COVID-19. The best way to respond to COVID-19 was clearly by mounting a very aggressive campaign of contact tracing and like also contact tracing as well as testing. But then that would require very powerful states. And that's the reason why I think there are all these talks about empowering the states even more so that they can provide more effective response to a black swan event like a pandemic that can happen once every 10 years or every 100 years. But I think when we look into this more closely and really look into the details, I mean, we noticed that in South Korea, we had a much less friction cost coming from the our government handling of the virus. In China, even though the Chinese government claims that the Chinese people are actually essentially satisfied with the government's response to the pandemic, we know for a fact that the Chinese government instituted very aggressive lockdown in the huge swaths of the country, scale that's just unbelievable, which is mind-boggling. We are talking about hundreds of millions of people who've been locked down forcefully by the government, and there's no information about what was really going on behind the scenes. And then Chinese people didn't really have access to the government thinking and all that. So even though we are not seeing in China the manifestation of that cost, how people, the friction cost and people's disenchantment with the government, I'm sure there is a very underlying tension there that the Chinese government will have to pay for it eventually. In contrast, in Korea, I think in South Korea, because the government, not just this administration, but the previous administrations, we have to remind ourselves that South Korea have been democratic for the last 30 years. They tried really hard to introduce the role of transparency and openness to the governance. And I think in each failure that the South Korean government experienced, not just with the handling of the MERS back in 2015, which I explained to be a catalyst that led to the success of responding to COVID-19 this year. But then there's been other public scandals like corruption scandals, but also major accidents and all that the government did really a good job of trying to be more transparent about. And there's a very hard work done in terms of introducing and expanding the role of transparency and openness in governance in Korea in the last 10, 20 years. In addition to that, I think in Korea, I think the government, not just the government, but the political leadership, not just from the left, but also from the right, there's this consensus, this implicit consensus that we should have a lot of respect and protection for the government experts, and not just government experts, but expertise in general. So this idea of having, trying to separate politics from expertise, that actually aided a great deal in creating public trust in government's response to the pandemic. I think the public, Korean public, just like anybody else in the world, there's an innate distrust of the politicians, especially career politicians. But unlike in other parts of the world, especially compared to the United States, I think the public trust the experts here in Korea. And I think that's also why people essentially try to follow up what for instance, the KCDC, the agency in charge of responding to the pandemic, asked the public to do, such as voluntarily engage in social distancing measures, trying to avoid high-risk indoor spaces, which all led to, I think, to success in government's handling of the crisis. So, in sum, I think the key factor that separates an authoritarian regime like the Chinese regime to a liberal democratic system like Korea's is the role of resilience. And I think all systems have can suffer from unpredictable shocks to the system. But I think the democratic system, which is really well functioning, then it can handle the whole system, the whole shock in a much more effective way, because each component, each member of the system, including the public, they trust the government and trust the people who handle the policies. So I think that minimizes the friction cost of policy implementation, and that leads to essentially essentially a good handling of the crisis like this one. So added to that, I think one thing that I would like to add to this is that I think liberal democracy in general should understand after this episode, this crisis, that even though I believe in free market myself, we have to reassess the role of the government. I think the key understanding that key lesson that we have to derive from this crisis is that for the political system, for the economic system, and for the public health system to function effectively, we need to have a very well implemented mixed government, essentially a good balance between the public sector and the private sector, and that's been lacking in many areas. In China, we saw that the government was very opaque and mishandled the crisis and blew the crisis out of proportions. In the United States, we are seeing the opposite of this, where the government is just too much in the free market system, and the market, essentially the entire country is suffering from a form of market failure. So I think after this crisis is over, I think the liberal democrats should come to a consensus that there's no right answer to this. But then so far, the most effective answer was the right mix of a government and the free market. So I think that's something, the core value that I think the liberal democracies could share from now on and essentially propagate. With that, I wrap up my comments.
Thank you, Dr. Go. Nachiket, what will be your reaction to it?
One issue, I think that speakers have said some very wonderful things which I agree with. I think the one issue for India, a large country like ours, the involvement of community and community-based organizations in this has been missing. So it's a lot of it has been either private sector or the government, the two pillars. In India, though, because of the vast, landscape, there's a third pillar that I felt, again, by the benefit of hindsight, would have benefited if it was involved. Because the migrant crisis, the situation with old people, the rural-urban divisions, and now the compelling issue of you're having to reopen the lockdown, even though the disease burden is rising rapidly, to me suggests that there's one more. Dr. Go mentioned, beautifully the contrast between the American response, perhaps, and the Chinese response. I would say maybe we needed a third perspective as well of involving the community, which has not happened. And in some ways, the hardship imposed on the millions of Indians because of this kind of decision making may exceed the benefits of saving in terms of mortality and other things. So, it's a balance that I think we were not able to strike because there was not enough community engagement. So that was the only point I would make.
Nachiket, can I ask, as you've been working for many years now in the health system, designing policies and designing the actual priorities for the health system in India, but not only in India, because you obviously have an comparative experiences of different countries. What will be your take on the developments around the WHO that we are seeing today and during the pandemic, generally speaking? Can you assess on that a little bit?
I would say it's deeply distressing. The position that's being taken that we will weaken the WHO is really not in anybody's interest. As an Indian, as a developing country national, I am concerned that we don't have enough perspective on the ground from the developing country perspective. You see a lot of developing country responses, they are cut and paste from the European responses, which are not necessarily appropriate for us. So I would, of course, want the WHO to do more, understanding of what the developing countries' needs are. But that's a separate discussion about what can be done more or less by an organization. But to cut it off and to, really not support it well, I think is not necessarily such a good idea. I was the country director of the Gates Foundation in India for 4 years, and recently, and as some of you know, Gates Foundation is, after the US government, the second or third largest supporter of the WHO. And I'm certainly hoping that Bill and Melinda are able to do more. But you really need intergovernmental support and countries to come together to do this rather than just private philanthropy. So I am certainly very concerned about these announcements coming from the US.
Thank you, Nachiket. As Nachiket mentioned, Bill Gates Foundation, there is a, and we were talking about the propaganda machinery before. To go to this last round, we have a little bit more than 15 minutes left. The new myths that are coming along the pandemic and new propaganda waves that we are witnessing. For example, in Georgia, Bill Gates is probably now the most mythologized person around the pandemics. What he does, what he says, it's very often given with a completely different context, with a completely different understanding of the reality, and by that the propaganda machinery is trying to create new enemies, trying to create the new troublemakers out there in the world whom later they can put finger on and blame for all the troubles that the world has today. Elon Musk is another one, again, in Georgian case that with all the innovative approaches he offers to the world, the forces in Georgia are trying to portray it as a kind of massive control over the population and demonizing the success of those experiments and developments. What is it that you can identify one or two new myths that came along with the pandemic that we all need to fight against? 5G obviously is a big issue on that row, but I'm very much interested to hear the stories from the countries who are not necessarily poor, who are not necessarily relatable by the Russian or Chinese propaganda. Still, if there are stories developing out there in Japan or in Denmark or South Korea, India again, as to those to be used as scapegoats after the real economic crisis will come due to pandemic. I think we all.
So, Tina, can I respond to you?
Yes, I can hear you now. I think it froze for a second, but now I can see and hear it.
Sorry.
Yes, Mr. Ambassador.
In Japan, I haven't seen serious problematic propaganda yet. But you know that it's not the propaganda, but we hear very quite often to hear the BCG is a vaccine for the tuberculosis. It's a good for protecting the virus this time, and because of the reason why Japan's experience is a very low mortality rate because of tuberculosis vaccines we call BCG shot. And actually, when I was small, I got the shot, and so most of the Japanese people got the shot. It's not a fancy shot at all, but you know that there are a lot of rumors. This BCG shot was very good for preventing infected by the virus, contracted by the virus. But what I want to say is this is a kind of the rumor at this moment. I don't know that scientifically BCG is. I can say that the BCG is good for. But from now on, we need to figure out. It might be good, but it doesn't. It doesn't mean it will not be a good. I don't know at this moment. So maybe everybody's jointly that discussing and investigating and evaluating what is the most good important things. And of course, propaganda is always bring risks for this very, very open, transparent discussion. But we need to, conquer. We need to overcome this kind of, prejudiced opinion and over the discussion and in a very transparent and frankly way. So I want to urge every country's, high-level politics and scientists to get together to figure out what is, reason why the Korea have made a very big success in fighting with the virus, and also that what is the point of the Japanese, responding to the virus, and Denmark and India. So, of course, we are seeing some propaganda, but we need to make every effort to overcome this, propaganda. It's not the matter of the one country. So everybody should get together to talk about the, new solution or a new normal, and to avoid any prejudice or propaganda as much as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Go?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem with all the propaganda and the conspiracy theories and the fake news is that I think the Chinese citizens and the Chinese, ethnic Chinese have been stigmatized as being the vectors of transmission and all that type of stuff that I think us East Asians here, we kind of experience too, because we kind of look similar. But then again, I think in Korea, even though, we are right next to China, and then there was a little bit of at the beginning, at the initial phase of the pandemic, there's a little bit of a xenophobia going on, because there's some concern that the Chinese visitors could be transmitting the virus to Korea, to the Korean public. But then that, fear was gone, right away after, again, because the government been able to mount a very effective, aggressive contact tracing campaign, which showed that the Chinese visitors wasn't really the source of virus that was, spreading in the country at the moment. But then what happened after was that by coincidence, by pure randomness, there's been emergence of a cluster of infection, which was centered around some fringe religious groups. And that really created essentially essentially a lot of fear and a lot of I would say stigmatization of I would say minority social groups. We don't have ethnic minorities in Korea to a significant extent yet. So it was really about minority social groups that people didn't know much about, and because they pertain to a type of religion, essentially some people claim they also cult. So it developed a lot of paranoia in the society. And right now in Korea, that and after we essentially solved the problem, what happened was that the second, we have experienced a little bit of second wave in the last couple of weeks. Nothing compared to the magnitude of the epidemic spread we saw in the earlier this year, but still a small cluster again developed centered around the LGBT community in Korea. And that again created, sort of factor behind a renewed, I would say, essentially homophobia that made waves in the Korean society a little bit. So I think, I think even in a very successful cases in the world that been able to handle this kind of crisis, effective public health response should be accompanied by very effective communication strategy. And I think liberal democracy in general have an upper hand in this regard, because we have the free press, and or that sure some people might say that having a free press could also make the whole society vulnerable to the external propaganda or that. But then at the end of the day, if you have a very open, frank environment for discussion, I think we can handle in a spread of fake news that could target minority social groups and ethnic minorities. And I think, and also I think, follow that, I think not a single country can handle this kind of external propaganda, which actually has a little bit of a echo in the global ideological conflict that we're experiencing these days between the authoritarianism and the liberal democracies. Because except for certain, major liberal democratic blocs like the European Union or like the United States, because of huge size, small and medium-sized liberal democracies in general, they are vulnerable not just to the economic shocks, but also to ideological conflicts that's going on, raging right now in the globe. So in order to somewhat respond to that expectability, I think by comparing our cases and our dilemmas, I think people in respective countries can put this kind of issue into perspective, that we're not the only ones suffering from paranoia and then sense of persecution. The other people are also suffering from that. So I think in that sense, I think international coordination and free press is going to be the for now most optimal response to this kind of issues of propaganda and fake news.
Thank you, Dr. Go. I cannot let you go without asking if of course, if it is a relevant question at all, if there is any word you can share with us about North Korea. What is the situation there and what's going on in there?
So, I guess, it's always a 1+1 kind of deal with Korea. When you talk about South Korea, when you talk about North Korea, so yeah, North Korea is a little bit different case. I think North Korea, even though there's some speculation about what's going on inside the country because of the opacity, the opaque nature of the regime, I think that the regime has been able to somehow, I think they've been able to flatten the curve, I suspect. They conducted very aggressive quarantine campaign from the get-go. They isolated the country from the outside world. And the reason why they've been able to pull that off is because, we know that their political system is very outdated, but the founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, who's whatever he says is actually a law, a diktat in the country. He said a long time ago, at the end of the 50s, that socialist medicine is preventive medicine. So he essentially mandated a complete quarantine every time something suspicious happened anywhere in the world. So North Korea closed down the border, not just this time, but they also did the same thing back in 2015 when there was the Ebola crisis. Even though Ebola crisis was in a way restricted to Africa, to that geographic area, North Korea actually surprised a lot of people by closing down the border. And so many people found that to be rational, obviously because of the distance and by the fact that no country neighboring North Korea recorded a case of Ebola. So the reason why North Korea did that was because of what Kim Il-sung said a long time ago. So in a way, North Korea has been also successful in combating COVID-19, just like we did, but then for entirely different reasons. So in that sense, it's very interesting to contrast the two. But obviously, I'm sure that the international community is going to, use the lesson of South Korea and over North Korea.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. For obvious reasons, so we cannot have a speaker and panelists from North Korea, and it's always interesting to have some information about it. Thank you. Mr. Mortensen, Europe being weak and unable as part of big propaganda machinery.
Actually, I just wanted to make a very, very short contribution, because actually I am a bit baffled that it doesn't seem that the public opinion or any political forces in Denmark have entered into accepting any sort of conspiracy theories, which is really interesting, because usually you would find some traces of a blame game when you have a situation like this. Actually, it's interesting. For instance, I could have imagined that there would be lots of stories about the Chinese origin of the disease and so on, but it's not at all prevalent in the Danish discussion and so on. It appears that, I don't know how to explain it, but it appears that if there's an acceptance that this is something which can just happen and could come from anywhere, and there are no sort of unpleasant planning about this. Actually, you could have expected some blame on China, but the way you have seen blame on China, for instance, in Denmark, has been more the fact that we've seen much more awareness of the situation of Taiwan than we usually have, and there's much more concern about the independence of non-interference in Taiwan than what we usually have. So there hasn't really been much room for conspiracy theories, but that of course might change. But I think it's a general European, at least the European Union fact that there are no easy explanations as to why we have ended up in this terrible situation.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Nachiket, last words before we finish this discussion.
Honestly, it hasn't been my understanding. There's some stray theories here and there about what is going on, but there haven't been anything significant. The one concern that people have had about the Indian position has been on the hydroxychloroquine and the promotion of that idea, which is part of national policy now. So one could argue that's a little bit of a controversial area of trust for the Indian government. But other than that, there hasn't been that much by way of myth or something that's going on. Clearly, there is a desire in India to learn from many countries, and the Chinese experience, frankly, has been quite valuable to India because it's a large country, and that experience seems more relevant to us given our size than that of the smaller countries that have been able to do a good job. So I would say learning rather than kind of any sense of myth or any misinformation.
Thank you, Nachiket. Thank you all once again for joining us today, for finding time to share your experiences with the Georgian audience. And thank you all viewers and watchers who were on Facebook with us today. We will be back with more discussions. Tune in next Wednesday and Wednesdays after that to come. As long as we are not able to meet in person, as long as we cannot go back to the conference rooms and university audiences, we will try to keep the discussion on live, being it on Zoom or Facebook or any other available resources. Thank you very much, and wish you all health and a more optimistic future. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all.
Goodbye. A pleasure. Yeah.